Companies tell you a lot through who they put on their board. Stabex board as of 2026 is composed of Chebet himself as the executive chairman, Abraham Kipkoech Korir as director of projects and business development, Mustafa Bet as managing director, Kipto Justus as finance manager, Kafero Isaac as company secretary, Boniface Kipchirchir as head of operations, Valerie Chepto Limo as alternate director, Catherine Asemeit Omasete, and a Ugandan national named Anthony Kuka Cherotich. Now, there is one board member whose background deserves particular attention. Joseph Kipto Chebungei, the former director of the Kenya Civil Aviation Authority. Stabex launched aviation fueling operations at Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. On August 17, 2023, Jackson Chebet walked into State House in Entebbe. That's President Museveni's official residence, and had a sit-down meeting with the President of Uganda and the Vice President of Uganda, Jessica Alupo.
I'm pleased to introduce Stabex International, a dynamic and progressive entity poised to redefine the landscape of fuel, oil and gas industry here in Uganda and larger Africa.
Chebet told Museveni that Stabex had invested over $100 million in Uganda. He told him that they had over 100 stations across the country. He proposed setting up a cylinder manufacturing plant in Uganda. He talked about moving Stabex regional headquarters from Nairobi to Uganda once Hoima oil production begins. Museveni personally committed to facilitating Stabex operations by cutting through bureaucratic red tape. He assigned the vice president herself to ensure that the plans of the manufacturing plant they move forward. And on electricity costs for the manufacturing facility, he told Chebet directly, "For the electricity costs, don't worry. We are pushing it down to 5 cents for manufacturing." A president personally negotiating electricity prices for a private petroleum retailer's factory plants. That's a level of access that most CEOs of billion-dollar companies in East Africa, they don't receive. Now, there's also something that I found that was buried inside the research, but I think it's also important. Jackson Kiplimo Chebet is not just a private businessman running a fuel company. He is also a board member and, crucially, the chairperson of the Strategy and Development Committee of the LAPSSET Corridor Development Authority. LAPSSET, that stands for Lamu Port, South Sudan, and Ethiopia Transport Corridor. It's arguably Kenya's single most ambitious and strategically important infrastructure project. We are talking about a deep water port in Lamu, an oil pipeline from Lokicha in Kenya's north to that port, a highway, a railway, and a resort city, all linking Kenya to Ethiopia and South Sudan. The oil pipeline component of LAPSSET would directly affect how petroleum products move through Kenya and East Africa. Is that conflict of interest? That one I'll let you decide. Now let's talk about the political storm, and this is where the story shifts. In August 2022, William Ruto won the Kenyan presidential election. He was sworn in as the 5th president of Kenya on September 13th, 2022. And from that moment, every business move that Jackson Chebet made, it was going to be viewed through a political lens. To understand the April 2026 moment, you need to understand what Kenya's government-to-government petroleum framework actually is. After 2022, Kenya entered into petroleum supply agreements directly between governments. You know, Kenya dealing with Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Abu Dhabi at a state-to-state level, instead of going through the traditional open tender system where private companies compete to import fuel. The argument for this system is stability. You lock in supply, you negotiate better prices, and you protect against market shocks. Now, there was criticism from the opposition and the civil society, and they were talking about opacity. When government negotiates directly with government, the middlemen who handle the actual logistics and distribution of the fuel in Kenya, they are selected through processes that are not transparent. And if those middlemen are politically connected, they receive an enormous commercial advantage without ever having to compete for it on merit. Let's now talk about when Gachagua decided to take the pulpit. Literally. He claimed that President Ruto was conducting petroleum business through 2 companies, Stabex International and Gulf Energy. He claimed that since taking office, Ruto had made profits exceeding 1.5 trillion shillings through these companies. He named 4 people that he said were the team leaders of what he called a fuel scandal. President William Ruto, Head of Public Service Felix Koskei, Energy Cabinet Secretary Opiyo Wandayi, and a local company. He also alleged that on the nights of April 5th and 6th, Ruto had dispatched a high-powered delegation, including CS Wandayi and the acting EPRA CEO, to secretly renegotiate fuel pricing with international oil companies, and that Gulf Energy was the nominated agent in those negotiations. He went further, claiming that at the current pricing structure, Ruto personally earned 5 shillings on every litre of fuel consumed by Kenyans. These ones, they are extraordinary claims. The kinds of claims that, if true, they would constitute one of the largest presidential corruption scandals in African history. The government response came quickly and in 2 distinct parts. The first part, CS Opiyo Wandayi, he issued a statement on April 5th, 2026, defending the G2G framework and specifically addressing Stabex. Stabex International is not among the oil marketing companies nominated by international oil firms under the G2G agreement. The second part of the government's response was the investigation. 4 civil servants were arrested in connection with the fuel crisis. The government framed the narrative like this: rogue officials had gone around the proper G2G process to do emergency procurement that broke the rules. Then this was the opposition's counter-narrative. They said the rogue civil servants, they were being made into scapegoats to protect the people who actually benefited from the broken system. Neither narrative has been conclusively validated. Now we've landed on the part where we are talking about the lawsuits, and the first place we are starting with is when Stabex sues Gachagua. On approximately April 18th, 2026, the lawsuit arrived at Milimani Commercial Courts. The plaintiffs were Stabex International Limited, Jackson Kiplimo Chebet, and Ultra Eureka Limited. The defendant was Rigathi Gachagua. Cause of action was defamation. The legal team had sent Gachagua a demand letter on April 9th, 2026, asking for immediate retraction and unconditional apology. Gachagua did not comply, so they went to court. The first plaintiff, Stabex, has no involvement whatsoever in the G2G framework, no proxy relationship with the president, and no illicit dealings. The defendant, Gachagua, acted in actual malice, political jealousy, and reckless disregard for the truth. He failed to verify any facts, ignored public records, and deliberately chose inflammatory language to incite public outrage for political gain. The plaintiffs are seeking general and exemplary damages, a permanent injunction, restraining Gachagua from repeating or publishing the statements, and a public apology. While the defamation case was building, there was another legal battle happening simultaneously. On the morning of October 1st, 2024, Kenya's National Assembly was gathered to vote on the impeachment of Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua. Every television in Kenya was tuned to the parliamentary proceedings. The country was watching. And while all of Kenya was watching Parliament, officials from a company called Ultra Eureka Limited, they were in a completely different building, signing paperwork and paying a 45 million shilling deposit to buy a property. And the property is a 6.8-acre leasehold in Karen, one of Nairobi's most prestigious neighborhoods. On it is Dari Business Park, Tamarind Karen Restaurant, and Entim Sidai Wellness Sanctuary. The owner, or rather the distressed seller, was Raphael Tuju, a former cabinet secretary. He's the Secretary General of the Jubilee Party, and he's a senior figure in Kenya's political establishment. The buyer was Ultra Eureka Limited, owned entirely by Jackson Kiplimo Chebet. The price was 450 million shillings for a property that Tuju valued at 3.5 billion shillings. So how did this happen? This is a story that starts in 2015. In April 2015, Tuju's company, called Dari Limited, it took a loan from the East African Development Bank. That was $9.3 million, approximately 1.2 billion at the time. The loan was meant to fund a luxury residential development on the Karen land. The security of the loan was the Karen properties themselves, plus personal guarantees from Tuju and his children. The loan went into default by mid-2016, 1 year after it was taken. Tuju says EADB never fully disbursed the construction funds. They gave him money to buy the land, but withheld the 294 million shillings meant for building the houses, which meant he couldn't regenerate the revenue to service the loan. EADB took the matter to arbitration, then to court in London. They got an English judgment in June 2019 for over $15.1 million. The loan had grown with interest and penalties. That English judgment was recognized by Kenya's High Court, and by 2026, the total claimed debt had ballooned to over 4.5 billion shillings. Years of legal battles followed, back and forth through multiple courts. Eventually, EADB had enough. They appointed Garam Investments auctioneers and advertised the properties for sale. Court orders had been obtained. The sale was going to happen. And on October 1st, 2024, the day Kenya was watching Gachagua being impeached, that auction happened. Why is this property deal significant? 1. Ultra Eureka Limited, the buyer, is normally an agronomy company. An agronomy company buying a hospitality complex in Karen is a bit of a departure from the seedling business. 2. The transaction was executed on the single most politically distracting day of the entire year. 3. After completing the purchase in February 2025, Ultra Eureka immediately charged the property's title to Kenya Commercial Bank for a $2.5 million loan.